This is the Uncovered Dish Christian Leadership Podcast.
The podcast that uncovers stories, equips leaders, and changes the world. Hello, everyone. This is the Uncovered Dish Christian Leadership Podcast, the podcast that uncovers stories, equips leaders, and changes the world. And we are your hosts, James Lee.
And Caitlin Deal.
So for the upcoming LAITY Leadership Academy, we have Eric Valosin coming in to teach a track on creating your church website. Is that true, Eric? Right?
Yes.
But today we're not going to be talking about that. Well, maybe a little bit at the end. But today, we wanted to talk about how we can incorporate old media, old forms of art, and new forms of technology and mesh them together to enhance our worship experience. Sounds pretty crazy, though.
Yeah, I'm really interested because new and old media is like really, I'm not really even sure what that means. So you're going to have to really define that for me. But first, can you tell us a little about yourself?
Sure. I guess it's probably worth noting I'm an artist primarily, so that's kind of my entry point into this subject matter. I'm a lifelong United Methodist. I grew up in the New Jersey Annual Conference, went to Drew University for my undergraduate, and then Montclair State University for my Master's of Fine Arts. The whole time that I've been in art, I've been really interested in the intersection of art and faith. But really until grad school, I had a hard time figuring out what that actually looks like to take an honest approach to it that does neither a disservice to the art or the faith.
Right.
So many times you see watered down faith in order to have good art, or watered down art in order to have good faith. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was finding was that all of the research that I was doing and all of the work that I was creating was premised on these ideas that were more or less founded in the 1400s and earlier. Just by sheer means to an end, I ended up using a digital projector for one of my projects. And it started to feel really necessary to me that I take a look at what does it mean that this digital projector is projecting this 14th century theology? And what does it mean for my 14th century theology now that we're not in the 14th century and we've got things like postmodernism and cyberspace? I started to really take a look at distilling down to the primary experience of spiritual experience, of mystical experience. And how can we approach that from a contemporarily responsible perspective.
When you say 14th century theology, can you just clarify that?
Sure.
As opposed to postmodernism?
Sure. So I guess I had been reading a lot of, for example, Meister Eckhart and medieval theologians that very much rely on Plato and Greek Neoplatonic theology and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And what we find out is that basically a lot of the way they saw the world is insidiously infused in the way we see the world, except that we don't know it is. And so when globalism happens and our worldviews shift, our theology often doesn't make that leap with us. And then we end up at odds with ourselves and we don't even know it.
Right.
Cut to the end of the story, I tried to take new media and old media, these new technologies and these conventional, traditional ways of approaching the divine, and put them together and see how I can come at facilitating spiritual experience through these newer technologies.
What are some examples of kind of old media that you're referring to and this new media? So can you guys clarify what you see falls under the category of old traditional forms of media and worship, and then what new forms are?
Take old media like painting and stained glass, for example. Mm-hmm. Both very traditionally steeped in religious tradition. They've been around for as long as art and Christianity have been around.
Right.
I tried to start thinking about ways to visually negate what we can comprehend. And through a whole bunch of studio experiments, I kind of stumbled onto this discovery that by blending painted color with projected color, you can create these color blends. If you take complementary colors, so the opposites of each other on a color wheel, blue and orange, if you mix them and they're perfectly calibrated, it'll turn out to be neutral gray. So if you take all the different colors that you're working with and blend them perfectly with their complements, you can get all these different colors to be neutral gray.
So for instance, if you had like a purple painted square, let's say, and you project a yellow square on top of it,
exactly,
you would get a white gray.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so if you can calibrate that for considering the ambient light in the room and all of that stuff, what I've actually done is I've created a body of work where it does negate out into basically a gray field. But then when you walk in front of the projector, your body blocks the projected part of that color blend. So you actually reveal the color in your shadow. So where you'd think I'm obstructing the image, you're actually revealing the image. And in your shadow, you get the color rather than the darkness.
I feel like there's a sermon there.
I would hope. I hope, yeah. I feel like that sort of light-based, projection-based media is already very theologically charged. So I'm trying to capture that, but using contemporary projection rather than traditional projection.
So there's this term, I think we saw you use, is the Techno-Sublime. I thought it was a band, actually, at first. I was like,
that's a good band name.
Right? I think Sublime is the band name. Sorry, another. I was like, damn, is this not like a band? Like,
They've upgraded to Techno-Sublime.
Techno-Sublime. So what is that?
Well, it's going to be my new band now, but so it's a term that an art critic, Hal Foster, coined, and it means a sublime effect that's pushed through technological mediation. Again, going back to this like old traditional metaphysics, we sort of think of mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, as these ineffable, immediate experiences. People historically have referred to them as having unmediated immediacy. It's this direct experience of God. But increasingly, we're finding out that perhaps it could be argued that all experience is mediated, and everything comes through a mediator, a medium. Something we don't experience anything directly. Even our brains and our eyes are mediating something that we experience, or the person you're speaking to is a mediator for what God is saying to you, or whatever the case may be. Carry that on to projectors or to pencils or to paints or whatever the medium is. So looking at how do we have these experiences, considering that they sometimes are pushed through mediation or are necessarily pushed through mediation, and how do you have a sublime experience that's hyper-mediated? Because now we live in a hyper-mediated world where we have 30,000 screens at our disposal at every given moment, and cyberspace is all around us.
So you're saying, how do we experience the divine in today's context, basically?
Basically, yeah.
Interesting. So I'm curious how this all plays in on a Sunday morning experience in a local church, right? So my understanding is that you have begun applying some of these ideas and these forms of art in your worship experience in your church, right?
Yeah, in a few churches. On one hand, you can use technology and these new tools as a supplement to the worship experience, or like a resource for the worship experience, or you can use them as a facilitator for the experience itself, a carrier for the experience itself. And I think being clear about those two things is important, because on one hand, you might be, for example, creating a website or engaging on social media, but there's also the idea of it carrying the worship experience in the moment. And I think we need to remember that the worship experience is exactly meant to be experiential. And so thinking about how to deliver that experience, how to help people get into a place where they are open to experiencing God.
Yeah, what are some examples of actually, so not just using these forms of media for supplementing the worship experience, but actually facilitating it? What are some examples of that?
What a lot of people are doing to great effect with projectors is actually using it to create an ambiance, using it to create an environment. Rather than just projecting words onto a screen, maybe you just need to project a color. Maybe you need to project an environment, some sort of imagery. You can almost think of it in terms of theater design, right? When something is happening on stage, they're not projecting the words that they're saying. They're projecting an environment behind them to help you feel what's being said. So thinking of it as a total package where the visuals go hand in hand with what you're hearing, what you're seeing. So that kind of brings me to this idea of a multi-sensory experience. So what media can we use that provide a multi-sensory experience? Not only auditory, but visual, perhaps touch, perhaps smell.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So interesting you mentioned all the different sensories as well, because I'm serving a local church right now, and we also rent out the space to a Coptic church. In the Coptic church worship experience, incense is a very big part of the worship experience. The priest would walk around just spinning this little, the incense was coming out of the censer, and they said something to the extent of it represents the womb of Mary holding Jesus, and how as we spread this aroma, we are spreading the aroma of the Spirit.
Which actually is a really a really interesting point, because those are only effective if you're in on the symbolism.
Right.
And so that's another thing we have to be very careful, especially as we're welcoming new visitors, is making sure that it's accessible, because we don't want to be so loaded in visual splendor and symbolism that it's opaque to anybody who's not on the inside.
Right.
I was commissioned to do a temporary installation in a church that had a kind of distinguished slant to their altar space. Up in their chancel area. And so I did an interactive projection mapped onto that ceiling space. So this divine imagery that's creating the altar space is actually compiled of the congregants themselves. And then as you walk up to experience it, because of the nature of projection, the medium itself and its limitations, it pixelates and dissolves the closer you get. So you have this same, going back to my sort of mystical theology of the closer you try and get to it, the more elusive it becomes, the more unknowable it becomes. And that was really nice for people on a sort of gut experiential level, but in order for them to really appreciate it, I also had a contemplative service where that was the focus of it, and I led meditations and prayers based around that, so they had time to spend with that undistracted. I also had an artist talk where I gave them the background behind why I did it and how I did it, and fielded questions, so that people aren't versed in art generally. Yeah. Even artists aren't versed in art sometimes. So having an entry point where people can feel comfortable to ask silly questions, and explain my theology behind my choices. So trying to make it a more well-rounded experience that's accessible to the people who don't get it, but also give space for people who do get it to just experience it.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I kind of want to go to that church. We have some projectors. We actually have some projectors here. You might
well, this was actually is a church called Trinity United Church in Warren, New Jersey. It was it's a Presbyterian and UCC church. And that's unfortunately the installation is down now. It was a temporary installation, but.
That's really cool. That is just an experience. You're just not going to church on Sunday at night. You're going it's an experience.
Right.
It's a different experience, and that's really fascinating. Now, if somebody wanted to do this in their church, how can they go about doing it?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you're interested in creating sort of like a artistic experience, is partner with artists. Pastors are really good at being pastors. They don't have to be really good at being artists. Everyone has different gifts, and it's really important to utilize the gifts in the body of your congregation. And there are often very gifted people in a lot of things you don't know they're gifted at. And so if you allow people to bring their gifts forward and say, what are you passionate about doing and how can we use that? You'll get better ideas than I can give you. This came about for me because they found out in that church that I'm an artist, and they said, hey, you're doing some interesting stuff. Can you do interesting stuff with us? But no one on that worship team would have thought of what I thought of, just like I wouldn't think of what someone else in a congregation might think of. So being open to the gifts of your congregants and partnering with them, coming alongside them and supporting their vision, even outside of your church, partner with local artists. Artists are always looking for opportunities. There are a few churches and institutions that do artist in residence programs, where, even if nothing else, it's great resume fodder for an artist to have an artist in residence position where they can use this church as their artistic playground to some pre-agreed upon, situation. And then the church can sponsor that person's art by endorsing it and saying, giving them exposure, but then also allowing the discussion that brings other people into it on a more accessible level, as well as I was trying to say before.
So in the churches where you're experimenting with these different worship experiences, say at Trinity Church in Warren, what was the feedback you got from the worshipers?
Well, you always get a mixed bag, right? Anytime you're trying something new, you get a mixed bag. There's always some that push back, and there's always some that think it's the best thing that's ever happened. And so there were some that said, well, that was nice, but I totally didn't get it. And those are the people that I encourage to come, hey, next week we're having an artist talk. Come back and let me tell you about it and see if you appreciate it differently. And I had people who came and said that this totally transformed their way of experiencing God on that Sunday, and that they noticed things that they'd never noticed before. One person was struck by the interconnectedness of everyone, saying that I realized that I was watching what I thought was myself, and it turned out to be someone else in that image, that it was their color shape that was moving, not mine. And I started to realize that they and our colors were mixing, and we were becoming some sort of interconnected color.
It's so powerful. I don't know, just listen to it. It's so powerful, like the experience that they had.
I think that's very the experience that you're just describing now. I feel it's very applicable to today as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, and that, it's something that I've thought a lot about, is that art in itself, I've referred to it before as empathy training, because really at its heart, art is about asking the questions and exploring the questions that are most fundamental to your understanding of the world. These matters of ultimate concern that really keep you up at night and make you think, how does this world work? How does this universe work? And so for you to put art out into the world requires that someone else step into that worldview, to step into your shoes and try and see the world from your perspective for the moment that they're viewing that art. And in order to successfully make art, you have to be thinking about other people, how they're going to receive it, how they're going to see it. So you're constantly putting, whether you're making or viewing art, constantly putting yourself into someone else's shoes and trying to see a different worldview. Increasing our use of art, whatever the medium, visual or otherwise, and really thoughtful, conceptual-based art, not just pretty pictures of flowers, but something that's really trying to dig into deep stuff, helps us understand each other on a human level and on an empathic level. And it starts to bridge those gaps, and you start to see that much to the chagrin of the 14th century Neoplatonists, truth is actually a colliding of worldviews, right? Truth is the messy intersection of a bunch of different people's interpretations of life, and how God is shown through that, where God breaks into where the rubber hits the road of all of these intersecting worldviews.
Amen.
You're
going to church.
All right, I'll see you later, guys.
I know, like, we're done. Mic drop right there. Oh my goodness. So why is it important? You touched a lot on this before, but why is it important for churches to really explore different media, for worship?
Well, I think in the 70s, there's a media theorist, Marshall McLuhan, who's become kind of the poster boy for media theory. He said it best when he said the medium is the message. We cannot communicate without the medium affecting what we're communicating. The example I gave once at a workshop I led at the Drew University's Drew Theological School Summer Music Institute was I showed a picture of a handwritten note, kind of in bubbly letters, that said, "Meet me at the park at 7 p.m." Smiley face, winking face. Oh, hey, right? And it was on red paper, and then I showed the exact same writing, the same message. Meet me at the park at 6 o'clock at sunset. Winking face, but in cut and pasted magazine letters, and it looked like a ransom note, right? and you start to think, oh, this is actually a threat, and if I don't show up, someone's going to get severely injured.
Wow.
The content is the same, the medium changed, and the message totally changed.
Wow.
So you cannot divorce the content from the medium and think your message is going to be the same. So when we use projection just because it's the new hip thing, or when we use a bulletin because that's what we've always used, we're putting a lot of time and effort into content. Pastors are thinking endlessly about how to link the songs that they choose to the scriptures that they choose to the sermon that they're going to give, put this whole package together. But we're not often paying much attention to the medium that's delivering it to people and how that medium is changing it for people. What does it mean for that same content to be delivered as a video as opposed to something auditory? There's a fantastic book on this by Shane Hoops called Flickering Pixels. And it's a look into a Christian interpretation of media theory and how the medium affects the Christian message.
What was that book called?
Flickering Pixels by Shane Hoops.
That's so interesting.
Flickering Pixels. I mean, from everything you're talking about, right away, the question I want to ask you is the medium of preaching at a pulpit dead?
Ooh, that's a great question.
We're getting deep now. James is breaking out the good ones.
So I don't know that I can give you a definitive yes or no answer, but I can tell you kind of an interesting backstory, I guess. So back in the pre-print era, before the printing press, we had more of an oral culture. As we know, the Bible stories were passed down more through oral tradition. And what this did was this created an oral understanding. The medium created an oral understanding of theology. And the way we experience sound is very different than the way we experience print, right? It's immersive, it's all around us, it's undefined. It's very hard to pinpoint where a sound is coming from or what that sound is unless you pair it with other senses as well. Mm-hmm. So we have this experience of God as being this undefinable, immersive experience. Then when the printing press comes along, this totally revolutionized and democratized our access to theology, right? Everyone who could read could now figure out theology for themselves to some extent. But what it also did was it got us used to experiencing God in a print fashion, which is orderly, which is sequenced, which is syllogistic. One thing, if A is so and B is so, then A plus B equals C. All of these things are ordered and from left to right, and it's expected and it's predictable. And if it's not logically coherent, you can throw it away. And we start to apply that to our understanding of God. Mm-hmm. If it's not definable and boxable and logically consistent, you can throw it away. And if it's not ordered and sequential and visual because we read it, we don't trust it as much, right? So now our experience of God, what it has done, we even started organizing our pews that way, right? We actually, if you do look at a set of pews from above, it looks like text on a page. You've got the title at the top where the preacher is standing, and then you've got literally horizontal lines from left to right going down the page of pews. We actually experience our entire, whereas if you look at, for example, a Quaker service, which relies much less on text and much more on silence and experience, they have circular formats, and their focus is inwardness and interiority. So they actually structure their churches to have an interior structure. Right. So we've actually completely rewired our brains in the way that we experience theology because of the medium of print. And so there's no telling exactly how we're rewiring our brains with the medium of the internet.
That's scary to think about.
But not all of print is bad, right? And it's not all the internet is bad. And so can we figure out and really think critically about what is the impact that this is having, both short-term and long-term? And how do we then use that thoughtfully to be just as logically consistent with our sermon as our song choice and our scripture readings are? That's not an easy answer, but it's hopefully a useful question.
No, it's not. And actually, my question was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but thank you for answering it in a very, very interesting way. Yeah, because I wrestle with that because it is such a traditional old form of media. I still feel there is some impact there, but I think perhaps going into the Techno-Sublime and what you were talking thus far, maybe the medium, this old medium of preaching or speaking should not exist in and of itself or stand alone in the worship experience, perhaps.
I suspect that the days of it being the primary focal point are on their last legs. If you look at media culture in general, we've moved from a one-to-many approach to a many-to-many approach. One-to-many being like there's the one figurehead who disseminates information to the masses, mass media culture. You've got the robber baron newspaper leader who disseminates truth to the masses. But now we have social media. We have a many-to-many experience where each person who receives that news is just as capable of producing their own news. And not only can they talk back to the person giving the news, but they can talk to each other in sort of a lateral crisscrossing of intersecting many to many sources.
Yeah.
So I suspect that that's why people's attention spans for sermons are shorter. When John Wesley preached for hours at an end and people were riveted.
Right. Now it's like 20 minutes
today. Yeah.
20 minutes.
You get pitchforks if your sermon goes over. So I think being mindful of the need for a many-to-many user-definable approach to the sermon might be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, no easy answers here.
Right. Sorry.
No, but it's, hopefully, if you're on the treadmill right now and listening to this, hopefully it'll just get you thinking a little bit more about Sunday. All right. Let's shift for a little moment and talk about just briefly, the workshop you will be giving at LAITY Leadership Academy on creating a church website. From everything we talked about today, my guess is that it's not just going to be like a WordPress training.
No, there will be a little bit of practical technical training, but part of what I want to focus on is the intangibles behind what makes a website successful. Branding, the user interface and strategies behind trends in website design, and basically what groundwork has to be laid before the HTML code can ever be put in place. So that's a lot of what I think, at least part of the workshop's going to be.
Wow, and who it should come? Like, who are the people that should be targeted? Is it, obviously lay members, but those who have a passion for it, those who are already involved or are interested in, starting a website? Is it intermediate, beginners?
Yeah, all of the above. I'm gearing it more towards beginners. I'm assuming that people aren't going to come in full stack coders, and I'm also assuming that these are not even webmasters. These are people who have been stuck with a website and now have to maintain it. But I think it will be applicable to people even outside of the practical web design element, but also how do you brand your church? How do you market your church in a general? We're going to be talking about the 3 C's of branding and what that looks like, translating the mission statement of a church and our theology to something that we can put on a website.
Have you seen a church with a website that in and of itself is a worship experience and an artistic worship experience?
Wow.
Told you it's early, but he's breaking out the big guns
Yeah.
today.
Didn't sleep too good last night, so I'm just like...
Well, I'll tell you what, if you do that, it'll be a really, really interesting website. So I can tell you how I approach it from an artistic standpoint, but this doesn't necessarily translate to website design. I've used the internet as a medium for facilitating a spiritual experience. For example, I've made hand-drawn mandalas, which are meditative images that come out of both Eastern and Western religious traditions. And the idea is to meditate on these images, and as you get to the center, you find truth. Again, in my postmodern pushback of that centralized notion of truth, I have confounded that by taking a functioning QR code, which is those square barcodes that you see on a lot of advertisements and stuff that you can scan with your phone, and drawing that into the mandala. So it's conflating this religious imagery with a QR code, and when you scan it, it actually launches you somewhere into cyberspace to complete this meditation. In particular, the one that I was starting to talk about, the code that I put in launches you to a randomized website. So every time you scan it, it sends you somewhere completely different.
Oh, wow.
So it's opening you up to the idea that truth is not just found in the center of this drawing. It's found anywhere you end up. And it's up to you to find out where the theological content in that destination is. To think that maybe God can show up even on a website, even in cyberspace, as well as in your physical interaction with this visual object in front of you.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
But then going back to what you were saying about how art needs to be explained as well, right? If I were to make a church website with this, I think it'll just tick people off a little bit.
Sure, very possible.
Every time I click this link that you tell me to click at the center of this mandala, sending me to a different website every time.
Sure, right, which is why...
See, I would keep doing it, thinking like somebody's like, I'm like the one where you have to flip over, flip back. I'll be like the one that keeps going back and forth on that person.
Right.
Yeah, I'll admit that.
Which is why that approach makes sense for my worldview and my theology and my specific application does not make sense for a church's websites. You have to pair your strategy with your goals. So think about just the way that you're thinking about what kind of maybe immersive projection is the right projection to help people feel the emotional content of what is being said at that moment.
Wow.
What are you trying to communicate through your website, and how do you get people to experience that in your website as well, not just read it? It could be something as just your color palette or your font selection, or it could be something really interactive, JavaScript based that you get some crazy programmer to do for you that has never been seen before, and you blaze a trail in website design. Who knows?
560 churches, one of you could do it.
Partner with your laity, right? I mean,
yeah.
How many large congregations probably have a full team of coders that they don't know about?
Right.
How many people are hobbyist technologists, right? I mean, the DIY culture, the do-it-yourself culture is more and more pervasive, and a lot of people have hidden skill sets. And if you can tap into what your congregants can do that they're not letting on about, that they might be passionate about, that might be really interested to work with the church in doing. However, they might not know that's a need. And so they're not going to bring it forth unless you, but it also, of course, that goes into the relational aspect of ministry. You have to get to know your congregation on a tell me what's beneath the surface that you're not readily telling people kind of level.
Yeah, and I think that's the journey that pastors are making and going through every week after week, right?
Absolutely.
Trying to understand the dynamics of every single congregant, what their gifts are, what their callings are, and trying to draw them all out and put it together and see what comes out of the community.
Yeah, you only have to have a really deep interpersonal, intimate relationship with anywhere from 20 to 3,000 people. I don't understand what's so hard about it. Yeah. You know.
There's the pastoring. Say in your church you want to try something new and you want to introduce a projector, but I know a lot of churches that people say, no, we can't set up the projector. It's going to get in the way of this and that, or right, or you can't block the cross, or there's a lot of pushback when it comes to introducing new technology. Right.
So
what do you do there?
First of all, get a small team of people behind you before you just do it.
Right.
But also tie it to a temporary event that has a clearly defined endpoint.
Okay.
So people who don't like it know that it's not lasting forever. For example, tie it to a sermon series, or tie it to a youth event. People let kids get away with a lot. And so if you want to do something really outside of the box, have the kids lead it. I think one thing to remember is that all old media that we're used to was once new media, and probably shocking to a lot of people. It's just constantly a hurdle we have to jump over. Otherwise, we just get stuck in the mud. You do want to sort of, in some senses, give them no choice but to at least experience it. They don't have to keep it, but at least be exposed to it. Try it on. And try and do it in a graceful way and with the support of as many people as you can, obviously. But the cutting edge, scary new media of today is going to be the stick in the mud technology of tomorrow. So we might as well start putting our sticks in the mud now.
Sounds good. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us today, Eric?
Well, if you're interested in checking out some of my artwork in person, early in September at the Watchung Art Center in Watchung, New Jersey, I'm going to be part of a group show there where I'm going to be showing some of my Techno-Sublime artwork, if you will. And then if you happen to be out in Mississippi listening to this podcast right now in October, I have a solo show at a new media gallery just outside of the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi in October 24th.
Great.
Wonderful. Great. So, Eric, thank you so much for coming on the show. My mind has been just blown this morning. It's a great way to start the morning. So, but
It's my pleasure.
Before we finish, though, we do have a last question that we ask all our guests. You want to do it?
So, yes. So if you can choose one, because the uncovered dish, I try to explain the context. I'm learning from you already. Because uncovered dish, and we're Mathis, we like to eat. So if you could pick one type of food, no variations, and you can only eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Does manna from heaven count?
Oh, what is it?
Manna from
Manna from heaven?
What is that?
No, from
It's
the biblical
Oh,
Bible.
that's why.
Some Old Testament nourishing dew that I can collect and
I'm like, is this a new food? I don't know.
get some Holy Spirit going on, maybe.
Wow, that's the most biblical answer we've got. I think what we were trying to get at is something more of like your favorite food.
I mean, I guess I could
that's
take
good
pizza.
answer.
That's fine. Pizza's
I feel
close.
bad now. I really want you to eat something you really want to eat the rest of your life.
So you said manna. So what manna? What?
Well, I mean, I feel like it's the best of both worlds because it's physically sustaining according to Scripture, but it's got to taste pretty interesting if it's actually coming from God directly, right? If it's physically manifested from heaven, and I think there's some culinary intrigue to it. No one knows exactly what it was or what it was made of, right?
That's true.
I think it would be a pretty useful and versatile food source.
Wow.
And if I'm gonna have it for every meal, I want to go with something divine. So,
Well, I mean, to get biblical on you though, the Hebrews got really sick of it after a while,
That's
and they
true.
wanted
That's a good
meat,
point.
and they were like complaining. They're like, "Oh, this is all we're gonna eat," and then God had to provide quails. So maybe it's not something you want to have for the rest of your life. But hey,
That's true. But,
hey, it's yeah.
but if it can lead me to a closer reliance on God as a result of my disgust of this decision today, then maybe it's worth it.
All right. So there's the discussion.
That it is.
The most biblical answer we've got on the uncovered dish. Manna from heaven. All right. Eric, thank you so much for being on the show again. We were with Eric Valosin. He is an artist. You can find out more about Eric at ericvalosin.com. That's ERICVALOSIN.com. And you could also meet Eric at the LAITY Leadership Academy. He will be giving teaching a track on creating a website. Again, that's the LAITY Leadership Academy. That's September 9th. You could register today at gnjumc.org. All right. Eric, thanks for being on the
Thank
show.
you very much.
All right. And, I hope you have a good beach day, too, after. You should probably hang out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you again for tuning in to today's podcast. If there are any topics you'd like us to uncover or any comments for us, you can email them to podcast@gnjumc.org. We will be posting a new podcast every other Wednesday, so if you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and subscribe to be up to date on the latest episodes. We'll